Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's program, Coffee with the Curator, NC A to Z. My name is Stacy and I handle adult education here at the museum, and it's my honor to introduce today's speakers, Diana Bell Kite, who's the Curator of Textiles and Clothing here at the museum, Katie Edwards, who's our Curator of Popular Culture, and Raylana Poteet, who acts as Chief Curator here at the museum. So welcome, ladies. Thanks for being with us. Ray, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stacy. Good morning, everybody. We're happy to have you here. We are going to talk to you a little bit today about our upcoming exhibit, North Carolina A to Z. We have all, the three of us who are here, worked on this exhibit. Let me get it going for you. And this is an exhibit that will be opening on September 3rd. This is something that the three of us along with the wider team have been working on for a while here. We're excited for it to open for you. It's an alphabetically based exhibit, as you might guess. So for each letter of the alphabet, we have something that will tie into it from North Carolina history. We've got loads of artifacts that we're excited to share, lots of people that we're profiling, events, all kinds of things from North Carolina history within this exhibit. So Diana and Katie are going to talk to you today about some of their favorite things in the exhibit. So we'll go ahead and get started. Katie?
Good morning. So as you can imagine, X was pretty difficult to kind of come up with a topic for. And so we wanted to kind of showcase some of our interesting artifacts that don't get to be seen a lot in exhibit. And so we kind of came up with this X is for extreme. This television is actually one of my favorite artifacts in the collection. It's probably one of the oldest televisions in North Carolina. It was purchased in circa 1931, but it was probably made in the late 1920s. And it was a mechanical television set that would be built from a kit. It was created, it's a Hollis Baird model 437. And Hollis Baird was an early television pioneer in mechanical televisions and producing them in the 1920s for the Baird Receiver Company in Massachusetts. And he co-founded the Shortwave and Television Laboratory, which was one of the first experimental television stations in the US. And what's interesting is Hollis Baird shouldn't be confused with John Loki Baird, who is usually credited as one of the early television pioneers. So there are two Bairds that have no relation that were two television pioneers, early television pioneers. And by the 1930s, mechanical televisions were being phased out and replaced by much more efficient electronic televisions. And so we have this one as extremely small because as you can see in the top, that is the screen. So try to imagine watching television on this little tiny square screen as opposed to what we have today. So televisions have come a long way in the past 100 years.
Thanks, Katie. I love that idea of having your iPhone set up way across the room and watching it like that's about the same size that this screen would be. Diana.
Yes. For the letter I, we went with I as for infection, something that has a lot of past and contemporary relevance for North Carolinians. And an artifact from our collection that we're showcasing for this area is an Emerson iron lung from the late 1940s, early 1950s. And iron lungs are very much associated with the polio epidemics. And in North Carolina, in the 1940s and 1950s, thousands were sickened from polio, especially children. And polio caused paralysis due to the virus's effect on the central nervous system. And some victims were permanently disabled by it. And if your chest muscles were paralyzed from the polio virus, then you needed help breathing. And so an artificial respirator, like an iron lung, would be used. The patient would be inside this chamber, and it would create a change in pressure that would pull the air into the lungs, like breathing. And nowadays, people who need artificial respiration use external ventilators that don't require them to be, encased inside this metal tube. But these did save many, many lives during the polio epidemic. And most victims would only use an iron lung for a few weeks until their central nervous system recovered, but some people did have to use these for the rest of their lives. And one particular story about the polio epidemic in North Carolina, in June 1944, during 3 days, the citizens of Hickory changed a local summer camp into the Hickory Emergency Infantile Paralysis Hospital, which became nicknamed the Miracle at Hickory. Hundreds of patients were treated there with very high success rates.
This is a great object that we're really excited to get a chance to display again. Very interesting and always makes me very glad we don't need to use them anymore. Katie.
So we have here, F is for film, the film industry here in North Carolina. These are some of the artifacts and objects we collected for a past exhibit called Starring North Carolina, which was a really fun exhibit I worked on several years ago. And this is an exciting opportunity to be able to showcase some of these objects again. So as many of you probably know, North Carolina was once known as Hollywood East because we had so many films being shot here, especially in, throughout the late 20th century. On the top left there is a kind of a fun Elvis-like costume that belonged to Earl Owensby, who was in the 1970s built an independent studio outside of Shelby, and there he produced and wrote and starred and directed a lot of independent films, and that's from a film called Living Legend, which was loosely based on the final years of Elvis. We also had, so Earl Owensby actually, I think, helped inspire, Dino De Laurentiis, who was a producer, to come here in the 1980s, early 1980s, to film Firestarter. As you see, those in the bottom left, there are some lobby cards that we have, and a crew badge. And Firestarter, actually, we like to say, kind of lit the spark for a lot of the films to be shot, especially around the Wilmington area. But when Dino De Laurentiis came here, he brought with him some crew that helped train locals, and they really created this this family of film crew that were just that really helped the film industry here and helped it thrive for many years. And we also have on the top there some costumes from the film The Hunger Games that was shot in several areas, several locations in North Carolina. The middle one there is it's a training suit that was actually worn by Leah Hancock, who was a gymnast at NC State. So there's a lot of North Carolina connections, and so it's exciting to really highlight the film industry again in this exhibit.
Yes, great way to show this really important industry in North Carolina with some fun objects. Diana.
We have another X here, another extreme artifact. We sort of enjoyed pulling together some of our more interesting objects that we don't get to show as often in this category. So this is a body removal basket. And this was used by Thomas Canute Council, who ran a general store in Green Level in Wake County. And he was also served as the community's undertaker. He had a funeral home adjoining his store. And he would use this basket to transport the corpse from the place of death to his funeral home for embalming and preparation. And baskets like this were available for funeral directors to purchase through national distributors of funeral and embalming products. So this is not a, specific to Mr. Council object. This is something that undertakers nationwide would have had access to in the early 20th century. But this is really emblematic of the period of the late 19th and early 20th century, where you see the funeral industry and profession really growing. And undertakers, especially in this region in the South, where this happened a little bit later than in other parts of the country, undertakers started taking on final rites that were previously handled within families, the preparation of the corpse, the preparation of the grave site, the burial. And one of the main reasons for this was the growth and popularity of embalming. And that really took off in the late 19th and 20th century in this region. And so this body really symbolizes that change from a family taking care of the final rites for a deceased loved one to an undertaker doing those tasks. So a really fascinating object.
Very unique piece that I think a lot of people will be surprised by or not familiar with. Katie.
So G is for Graveyard of the Atlantic, and we thought that was pretty a synonymous name for especially the Outer Banks, the coast of North Carolina, is known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic. And for many of y'all who don't know what that means, since the 1500s, more than 2,000 shipwrecks have been documented in those dangerous waters off the Outer Banks, and it's usually because of the shifting sandbars, strong clashing currents, navigational hazards, storms, hurricanes that have brought down so many ships and cargo and crew. And so in this area, we definitely wanted to talk about kind of that and the surfmen and the life-saving stations that popped up all around the Outer Banks that would be charged to rescue that crew from those ships. And so in this area, we talk about a variety of different surfmen, including Captain Richard Etheridge, who was born enslaved on Roanoke Island and ended up becoming the first. Captain Richard Etheridge became the first African American to command a life-saving station when he was appointed keeper at the Pea Island Station in 1880. So we talk about him. We talk about Rasmus Midget, who single-handedly helped save and rescue some crew of the ship Priscilla when it crashed in 1899. And so here we have an artifact we wanted to showcase, which is a Lyle gun and a faking box. And so a Lyle gun was used for shore rescues that would shoot out a projectile with a lifeline to help rescue crews from wrecked ships. And so the faking box up there above it was usually in a zigzag pattern to help the line from getting tangled. So there's several stories in here that we are happy to showcase in this exhibit.
This is a really great piece that shows how our geography has affected life in North Carolina over time, especially for those traveling along our coastline. Diana.
So one of my favorite parts of our collection, being the curator of textiles and clothing, is our quilt collection. And so Q, in my mind, had to be for quilts for this reason. We have a fabulous collection of quilts that from North Carolina from the past 250 years, representing nearly every county in the state and every region of the state. And so we picked 3 quilts to start out the exhibit to showcase some of the diversity and breadth of our collection. We have an 8-pointed star quilt from the mid-20th century that you see on the left, made by Eliza Helen Rogers Arrington of Wake County. And this very much is a scrap quilt that she made using sewing scraps, feed sacks, whatever fabric she had available. The middle quilt you see there is a snowball pattern quilt, and this was made by Caroline Johnson Owen of Sampson County. And she made this in the first half of the 19th century, right before she got married. And she actually signed her name on the back too, which is really neat. And the quilt on the right you see there is from the late 19th, early 20th century. And this was made by women of the Spears family from Iredell County. And this is a pattern that's only ever seen in the Western Piedmont of North Carolina. So a very regionally specific pattern, which is kind of neat as well. And so just really excited to get out some quilts that haven't been shown before, haven't been shown in a long time for people to see on exhibit.
Well, and as we've been telling you, we are excited, obviously, about getting some cool artifacts out there. But another opportunity that this exhibit gave us was to talk about some really interesting North Carolina people. And we've highlighted people in this exhibit who you may be familiar with, but also some whose stories you might not have heard before. So the curators are going to tell you about a few of those people now. Katie?
So sticking with the Graveyard of the Atlantic, we obviously wanted to talk about some of those lighthouses that also were, helped guide ships throughout the treacherous waters of the Outer Banks area. And North Carolina is home to lots of lighthouses. And one person that I came across when I was doing my research was Charlotte Ann Mason. I never realized that there were women out there who were also lighthouse keepers in the 1900s. And so she was actually, she was a lighthouse keeper for several years at Cape Lookout Lighthouse. And she was actually there when it got its distinctive checkered pattern, which was actually used as almost like arrows to kind of point the sailors. so they could know they were sailing east or west. The white diamonds meant east or west, and the black diamonds meant north or south. So it's kind of interesting tidbit. And so, men predominantly held the role of lighthouse keeper, but she actually took on for several years. And unlike her male counterpoints, she wasn't given a uniform to wear, but she was given a salary. And so her duties included standing watch, keeping in a daily logbook, cleaning the light, trimming the wicks, and hauling oil up the 216 steps daily. And so if any of us have been into a lighthouse and walked up a lighthouse, you realize it's pretty tight space and there's a lot of steps. And so imagine hauling up those heavy buckets daily, and how that must have been a tough duty to do. And so I just thought that she was interesting and definitely wanted to point her out in this area.
Great story of a very hardworking woman. Diana.
Another hardworking woman here. Back to I as for infection. This is Lula Al Gloin, and she was the first Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indian registered nurse, and the only Eastern Band of Cherokee Indian tribal member who was an officer during World War I. She was a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Nurses Corps. And she was very instrumental in advocating for public health in the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indian community on the Qualla boundary. She advocated strongly for immunization in her community. And she also served in the 1920s as a U.S. Indian Health Service nurse. And she advocated for establishing the first hospital on the Cherokee tribe's land. She advocated to the Bureau of Indian Affairs for establishing that hospital. And she also served as its first head nurse. So very much an instrumental person in improving public health on the Qualla boundary.
Another wonderful story we get to highlight. Katie.
So K is for Kitty Hawk. I mean, obviously we all know that North Carolina, the Wright brothers story is really important to the state's history, and our license plates say first in flight. But I also wanted to talk about the people in the Kitty Hawk area and the surrounding areas that really made that story happen and made that first flight happen. And so for this area, I wanted to focus on those people. And so on the left there, we have the Tates. And this photo was actually taken by the Wright brothers when they visited in 1900. And so Bill Tate is sitting there with his daughter, and his wife Addie is sitting in the middle right there. And the Tates were really just instrumental, especially Bill Tate. He was one of the first to write a letter to Wilbur Wright to kind of convince them to come to Kitty Hawk. And he's really a hero in the Wright brothers story in North Carolina. And so I wanted to focus on him, especially. His wife Addie was actually the postmistress of Kitty Hawk for many years. And on the right there are crewmen from Kitty Hawk and Kill Hills and those surrounding stations. And they were also really instrumental in helping the Wrights from 1900 to 1903. And even when they came back, they would help haul the gliders and the flyer up the sandy dunes. And they were heavy. They would deliver parcels to the Wrights. They would deliver other groceries and whatnot. They would escort visitors, and they just helped them throughout all the experiments. And so especially John T. Daniels, who was on in the photo on the right there, he was the one who took the famous photo of the first flight. And that was supposedly the only time he ever used a camera. So the people have fascinating stories, and I definitely wanted to focus on those North Carolinians in the Wright brothers story.
Yeah, it's really great that we can bring out that North Carolina tie in the story with this exhibit. Diana.
So U is for universities in this exhibit because North Carolina is known around the country and around the world for its high quality universities. And I wanted to focus on Bishop James Walker Hood because he has a very fascinating story, and he was very instrumental in founding one of North Carolina's HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, of which we have the highest number of four-year HBCUs in the nation as well. So James Walker Hood was born in Pennsylvania, and he became a clergyman in the AME Zion Church. He worked in New England and the Mid-Atlantic states. And then during the Civil War in 1863, he was sent as a missionary to North Carolina to encourage North Carolina congregations of Black Methodists to affiliate with the AME Zion Church. And he established multiple congregations in the state and became a bishop in 1872. And he also became active in politics here during the Reconstruction period, which was a very fascinating and pivotal time for establishing the rights of formerly enslaved people. He presided over the 1865 Freedmen's Convention in Raleigh, and he attended the state constitutional convention and advocated strongly for public education. And he helped establish the Zion Wesley Institute, which is still around today as Livingstone College in Salisbury. And he presided over the trustees of that institution for some 30 years. And he also, as an aside, was someone who was very committed to social justice and to combating discrimination. And he demanded throughout his lifetime to travel first class on railroads and streetcars. And he was never successfully removed from the first class accommodations during his entire life. He always managed to travel in whites only spaces because of his commitment and conviction to doing that. And so that's an interesting fact about him.
Another great story to highlight. Katie.
So B was an easy one. B is for basketball. In North Carolina, basketball is synonymous in North Carolina. It's huge. I grew up in here, and I grew up hearing about Tobacco Road, UNC, NC State, Duke, Wake Forest. But someone who is huge in the basketball story in the state is John McClendon. And I definitely wanted to emphasize him in this exhibit. He came from Kansas and worked under the tutelage of Dr. James Naismith, the inventor of basketball. And he became head coach of what is now North Carolina Central from 1940 to 1952. And he really brought kind of a fast-paced basketball, especially for Black audiences. Everett Case gets credited a lot for bringing fast-time basketball to NC State in the 1950s for white audiences. But John McClendon was first, and he helped pioneer and popularize basketball strategies such as the fast break, full court press, the zone press, and the four corners, which a lot of times gets credited to Dean Smith. But John McClendon was first, and he also helped facilitate what is now known as the secret game in 1944, which was a game held at the gym at North Carolina Central, and it was between the basketball team there and the medical school team at Duke. And it was such a big game because this was during the Jim Crow era where whites and blacks were not allowed to really associate. And so they did it it took place on a Sunday when most people were at church. It was very secretive. No one was allowed in the gym. And so it was pretty big. We look at it today as pretty big for race relations during that period. And so he just was such a rule breaker, but also a great advocate for just basketball and race relations in North Carolina.
Yeah, I love that we can use this story to highlight the history of such an important sport here, but also the history of civil rights in our state as well. And then Diana.
So C is for craft in this exhibit, and we have so many examples of the diverse craft traditions in North Carolina, from pottery making to wood carving to needlework. And you'll see a whole assortment of different craft items from our collection. And one of the people we're highlighting in this section is Nell Cole Graves. And she grew up in Montgomery County in a pottery making family. And she became one of the first women to turn pots in the Seagrove region. Traditionally, turning pots was considered men's work. And for that reason, she's considered Seagrove's first female potter by many people. At the time of the craft revival, which during the 1920s, there was this emphasis on looking back at traditional crafts and viewing them more through a lens of using them for decorative objects or selling them more widely nationally. she enjoyed making delicate, colorful pieces that appealed to consumers during this period. And she traveled around the country to promote her pottery and do demonstrations. And she worked at J.B. Cole's Pottery, which was her father's business, and her brother also worked there. But she worked there up until well into her 80s. And so she's very much legendary in the Seagrove pottery making community.
And another great way to highlight an important craft story for North Carolina. Katie.
So musicians was a fun and challenging area to work in, just because there are so many musicians from our state that we'd love to highlight, but obviously couldn't highlight everyone. So I just tried to choose some that kind of represent a variety of different musical genres. Like Link Ray up there in the top left was listed as number 45 in Rolling Stone magazine's 100 greatest artist of all time, greatest guitarist of all time, and he was from the Dunn area. Fred Huerta, who's up there in the top right, who's one of our newer musicians from Mexico, who's really brought kind of attention to that Mexican music in their state. And he actually had a hit song with his band called Raleigh. And so I won't go into too much detail, but if you come check out the exhibit, there's lots of different musicians. We actually I created an interactive that's kind of in the same format as A to Z, which was also very challenging to come up with. I got creative in some areas, but visitors can come and hear a variety of different clips from some of the musicians that were either born here or have made North Carolina their home for many years.
And Katie brings up a great point that the exhibit itself does have a lot of different interactives, hands-on elements, and wonderful audio-visual elements that you can experience for a lot of the content for the different letters. So we've told you about some of the artifacts and some of the people in the exhibit, and I just wanted to ask each of the curators before we finish up, what was something else or some other aspect that you enjoyed working on in the exhibit? Katie?
So for most exhibits that I work on, it's always fun to kind of create new relationships and new collaborations with other institutions throughout the state. And so for this exhibit, O is for outdoor drama. And so we wanted to talk about, or I was able to collaborate with several of our theater groups in North Carolina. I mean, we have the Lost Colony, which is the nation's longest running historic outdoor drama, which debuted in Roanoke Island in 1937. We have the Snow Camp Outdoor Theater, which creates shows like Pathway to Freedom and Sword of Peace, and they're all these historic dramas. And of course, the Lumbee Cultural Center and their outdoor drama Strike at the Wind, which focuses on the Lumbee folk hero Henry Berry Lowry. So I got to collaborate with some of these theaters and get photos and get set clips, and so that was really fun to work on. Also, the zoo, the Ashburn Zoo, our zoo is one of the only state-supported zoos in the nation. And so it was fun to work with them and to learn some more stories about the zoo, including the African elephant Cesar, who actually has had some joint issues and started doing elephant yoga, which I thought was really fun to learn about. And so you get to hear about these different stories as well.
And what about you, Diana?
Probably my favorite aspect of working on this exhibit was, as I've said already, getting to highlight some of the artifacts in our collection that aren't seen as often as we would like. And this is one example of an artifact like that. This is Tom Haywood's kicking machine that he built in the 1930s. And this was a roadside attraction in Craven County. And if you had ever said, I could kick myself, he made this machine that would kick you for you, that you could use to kick yourself. So you sort of stand in the middle and turn the crank, and the shoes on the little wheel kick you. And so just sort of a fun, whimsical item from our state's past that, we're finally getting to put on display.
Excellent. Well, we hope everybody will be able to come and see the exhibit. As I said, it opens on September 3rd. I think we've got maybe time for 1 or 2 questions. If anybody wants to put anything into the chat for us. Don't think we have anything right now. Give it just a sec.
I don't think we do quite yet. But I have a question for you guys, because I've been watching you put this exhibit together, obviously. What has inspired you the most about getting to work on this exhibit and learning all these amazing stories and all getting to highlight these pieces? What has been the most inspiring thing for each of you?
I've enjoyed
Anybody?
learning some of the people that we've been able to highlight in this exhibit have been maybe some of the lesser known folks in North Carolina history who made a really big impact, and just exploring their stories. People like Lula Al Gloin, who I mentioned earlier. I had not heard her story before working on this exhibit, and she's had a fascinating life and made such a big impact in her community. So for me, it's uncovering the individual people and bringing those to a larger audience.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. That was one of the great, I mean, with every exhibit we work on, the good thing about it is well, for me personally, I get to learn a lot. And so for something like this, we kind of divided each of the letters out between the three of us, and I was covering some topics that I probably wouldn't normally cover as a pop culture historian. And so it was kind of fun to like learn about some of these people, and just like you said, stories. And so that was, I don't have one particular that stands out, but they're all just really interesting to learn about and to share with the visitors when they come.
Yeah, I would agree that the concept of news stories or stories that you maybe didn't know as much about, whether it's a personal story or the story of an event, or even some of the stories behind our artifacts, just getting to bring some of that to light was really exciting and fun for us.
Well, I want to thank you guys so much for being with us today, and thank you for taking the time. This is so great. And I would love to welcome all of you to please come down. The exhibit opens on September 3rd, so please come down to the museum and check it out for yourself. It's going to be really incredible, and we can't wait. Thank you all. Have a lovely morning.
I think